from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. Are we living in a state ruled by the iron fist of wet human resources departments? In a move reminiscent of primary school days, the former Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, has been ordered to apologise by an independent expert panel for the crime of being rude to a chief whip, despite the fact that being rude is precisely the job of a chief whip to other people. The Financial Conduct Authority has finally woken up and issued a warning to banks who block politicians from holding accounts with them. Any bank that does decide to do what NatWest did to Mr Farage could face fines. The question is, what took the watchdog so long? It's been the defining story of the week, the concrete crisis, as Education Secretary Gillian Keegan cemented herself onto the front pages yesterday. Former top Mandarin appeared, or at least tried, to throw the Prime Minister under a bus, blaming him for the scandal. Does this breach the spirit of the civil services impartiality requirements? Plus, your favourite Mystic Mogg strikes again. Yesterday we launched the successful competition for incompetent councils, and today Birmingham City Council, Europe's largest council, has effectively declared bankruptcy as it faces a £760 million bill. We will be hearing from one of Birmingham's very own councillors on this matter. State of the Nation starts now. To be joined by a combative panel this evening, the journalist and broadcaster Michael Crick and the director of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young. As always, you know I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time for the news of the day with Aaron Armstrong.
Very good evening to you. I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. Birmingham City Council has effectively declared itself bankrupt. Europe's largest local authorities admitted it's unable to meet an equal pay claims dispute of £760 million. The council has already paid £1.1 billion to settle historical claims. All new spending, with the exception of protecting vulnerable people and statutory services, will stop immediately. More onshore wind farms are expected to be built as a result of new rules announced by the government. Projects supported by local people will be approved more quickly, and communities will also have a greater say in how developments are considered. Now, the new rules come amid fears of a backbench rebellion, and they represent a U-turn from Rishi Sunak, who in October said he intended to continue with a ban on new onshore farms. The Shadow Climate Secretary, Ed Miliband, says the bans exacerbated the cost of living crisis.
Government is being held to ransom by a bunch of Tory backbenchers who since 2015 have stopped onshore wind being built in England. And that has raised bills for families by £180 for every family in Britain. You know, we're going through a cost of living crisis. Surely now those individuals, those Conservative MPs can see that it's much better to have onshore wind built and cut bills for families.
The Schools Minister says the government has been proactive in dealing with the concrete crisis and has been issuing guidance since 2018. Speaking to GB News, Nick Gibbs' comments come after the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, was forced to apologise for using strong language while expressing her frustration at the situation. Both Ms Keegan and Rishi Sunak are under growing pressure as more than 100 schools across the UK have fully or partially closed. Laughing gas will be banned, and those caught in possession of the popular drug will face unlimited fines or up to 2 years in jail. New measures expected to be introduced this year will also see tougher penalties for the supply and production of the drug. It's been linked to antisocial behaviour, with heavy use possibly leading to anemia, nerve damage or paralysis. One person's died after a bus collided with a car on the Cleddau Bridge in Pembrokeshire. 9 other people were taken to hospital after the 52-seater bus crashed earlier today. One of the drivers was trapped and had to be freed by firefighters and evacuated by air ambulance. Wales First Minister says the incident is worrying and his thoughts are with those involved. Spain's Football Federation has sacked Jorge Vilda, the coach of its World Cup winning women's team. Vilda was the only member of the coaching staff who didn't stand down in protest after midfielder Jenny Hermoso was kissed on the lips by the Federation's president, Luis Rubiales. That's it for the moment. This is GB News live across the UK. I'll be back with more in just under an hour. Now it's over to Jacob.
The former Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, has been forced to apologise by the independent expert panel after it found he had bullied former Tory Chief Whip Wendy Morton via text. Now, Gavin Williamson's messages were rude and unhelpful, and you can read them online. I'm not going to go through them now, and in certain parts they were very unpleasant, which he accepts, and he's accepted, as he basically has to, the finding of the report. But this seems to me to be the most ridiculous idea in its fundamentals. Wendy Morton was the Chief Whip. The Chief Whip, from those of you who have watched House of Cards will know, is the person who has power in Parliament. Backbench MPs' careers are determined by the Chief Whip. Will you get office? Will life be made difficult for you in your local constituency association? Will you get a slip so that you can go to a family event? All of this is in the gift of the Chief Whip. The Chief Whip has patronage and power. The person who does not have power is somebody talking to the Chief Whip. And if that person is rude to the Chief Whip, the Chief Whip, as the person in authority, has to be able to cope with it. I was actually Leader of the House when the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme was set up. And it's very important. It's very important that within Parliament, people don't abuse power. But this was intended to protect the clerks, the cleaners, people's employees. It wasn't meant to protect ministers and powerful people arguing robustly with each other. And when you look at the definitions that have been used in the report, which I have in front of me, it says that bullying may be characterised as offensive, intimidating, malicious or insulting behaviour involving an abuse or misuse of power that can make a person feel vulnerable, upset, undermined, humiliated, denigrated or threatened. If you're the Chief Whip, you can't feel vulnerable, upset, undermined, humiliated, denigrated or threatened because you're the one with whom the power rests. And it seems to me the independent experts panel simply failed to understand the relationship of power between people in Parliament. I'm actually all in favour of professional people in a working environment and in other environments being polite to each other. I'm not in favour of people using what you might call Anglo-Saxon language. I think it is a sign of a failure to command the full vocabulary of English if you resort to swear words. But that doesn't mean that somebody should be punished for giving a forceful view to somebody who is not only equal in authority to him, but higher in authority to him. I think the Commissioner for Standards got it right. He dismissed the complaint. He said that there was not bullying, even though the behaviour wasn't great, and the independent panel has got it wrong. I'm also surprised that they allowed an extension to the deadline for bringing an appeal to the decision of the Commissioner. Surely we should all follow the same rules, and that as both sides knew the rules, there was very little excuse for extending the period available. Well, Gavin has accepted it, he's apologised, but I think this is fundamentally wet wipe territory. Of course, I want to hear from you. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts. You know the email by now, mailmog@gbnews.uk. But I'm delighted to be joined now by the co-founder of Novara Media, Aaron Bastani. And Aaron, thanks so much for coming in, because you had quite a rush to get here.
Immense pleasure.
It's always good to have you on. Shall we have a quick look at what Gavin had to say in his apology?
Please, go ahead.
I reiterate my apology made to the complainant following the breach. I apologise to them again now, and I apologise to the House fully and unreservedly.
I mean, I think it's a bit like putting people in the stocks. You make them abase themselves when they've had a row with somebody. But aren't you allowed to argue with people who are equal or in higher status to you in an organisation?
Well, Jacob, I want to know what happened to the Conservative Party. Like you say, we're in wet wipe territory, and I think it's right that he apologises. He was in the wrong. However, I think you're also right to highlight the fact that this drawn-out process, protracted process, almost performatively punishing him for what was ultimately a quite minor transgression. I think it says quite a lot about politics, but I think also the facts of the matter are that he should have apologised because it was unprofessional conduct.
He should definitely apologise for being rude. I'm all in favour of that. But it's the formal sanction of making him in the chamber of the House of Commons stand up and apologise. As I said in monologue, the ICGS I think is really important, but it's there to protect staff of the House of Commons from MPs who abuse their position, or actually, more often than not, more than MPs, it's been of their seniors within Parliament, within the professional element of Parliament, who have behaved inappropriately, or, to use that awful word, or have bullied them. It's not there for MPs dealing with each other, is it?
Well, look, I'm inclined to agree, and I think what he was doing was lashing out in a situation where ultimately he was powerless. And I think you're right to say there's a huge difference between that and bullying. In fact, it's the polar opposite. However, when you have rules, when you have a process, the point is that everybody has to adhere to them at all times. And I think as a sort of protocol that one is meant to uphold as a professional legislator, he fell short of the standards. And I have to say, the language he also used in regards to an aide, where he talked about the slitting of a throat, that's alleged, I should say.
That was a different matter. That wasn't...
Of course.
That wasn't part of this inquiry.
But it's additive, and I think it does... If this was a court of law, somebody would say it's their first-time offence, is this person of good character, and so on. And so I can see why it played against him, if you're trying to sort of play devil's advocate here.
But Gavin enjoys playing up to the image of the chief whip. I mean, he had a tarantula in his office and that sort of thing. He likes the power plays of politics and the House of Cards approach of Francis Urquhart in that. Nonetheless, I think it's still harsh to go on that and then say, well, look, you've been rude to your successor, and therefore you have to base yourself in Parliament. It just seems to me to be disproportionate, and that the Commissioner got it right when he said, basically, yes, this was very rude, yes, you shouldn't have said this, but no, it's not really a matter for me as standards, it's a matter for you as a moral individual to apologise privately if that's what you want to do.
What I find really interesting about this whole sort of carry-on is that the basis of it was basically a grievance over whether or not he could attend the Queen's funeral. I just find it strange that there's a jockeying for position amongst your colleagues with regards to state events and things like this. Now, I'm sure he held the Queen in great affection.
I think asking for tickets to events of this kind is not the sort of behaviour that I would encourage. I don't disagree with you on that at all. And people were doing it, obviously, for the coronation of the Queen's funeral. I think you wait your turn in these events, and that it doesn't look good for Gavin to have been demanding to go to a funeral at all. I completely agree with that. There's a big difference between doing something that's a little bit grubby and doing something that you have to be punished for. Isn't there?
Well, I just feel that, right now, our political class is held in such low esteem by the public, and you might say that's wrong, you might say that's right.
Oh, it's always the way.
You
can go back to Cicero saying that politicians aren't as they were a few decades
Partly, but I
before.
think that there are certain professions which are clearly held in much lower esteem than they were 30, 40 years ago. Journalists, business people, politicians, and like you say, that ebbs and flows. The banks, for instance, 60, 70 years ago, a bank manager was the quintessence of respectability and, the staid middle class. After 2008, very much not the case.
You say that, but who is the big figure of fun in Dad's army? It's the bank manager. And that's 50, 60 years ago. So I think we tend to look at the past through rose-tinted spectacles. I mean, I'm guilty of this myself quite a lot, but we didn't put people on quite such a pedestal, and we were certainly happier to mock people in authority. And there's a great English tradition of doing this. You look at the wonderful cartoons, late 18th and early 19th century, the Rowlandsons and Gilrays and so on.
But you're a very gentlemanly person. You're a very genteel person. I don't agree with you necessarily on many political issues. You're a clearly very affable, principled person. I might disagree on certain principles, but you can discuss those amicably. I think that the sort of language of veiled threats through text messages. First of all, if you're a professional politician, you shouldn't be threatening anybody in written communication. It just screams amateurishness. Especially for somebody who, again, he was working very closely with the British Armed Forces, the kinds of things that could be compromise on him. Amateurish, the analogous sort of political figure, say, in Russia or in the United States, wouldn't dare behave like that. And I think, actually, in a way, Gavin Williamson, he didn't really recognise or understand the position of seniority he held. And I think that's why, you're right, he's being publicly vilified as a result. But I think if he was just a little, non-entity backbencher, none of this would be happening.
Well, thank you very much for joining me as always, Aaron. Don't forget to let me know what you think, mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, has a watchdog found its bark and bite? Plus, the competition for incompetent councils continues.
This September, the GB News family is back together. From breakfast, right across the day, breaking the latest stories, and every evening. And don't forget the weekend. We've got the whole of the UK covered. Every week, we'll be hearing your views from up and down the country, with fun, lively and intelligent conversation with the biggest guests. This September, we'll meet Chris and John. Thank you for choosing GB News. We're proud to be Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with some quite fruity thoughts this evening. Peter, no apology should have been required. People must have free speech in this country, and we can all have arguments. It is part of our freedom. We should be allowed to express ourselves in our own ways. Elizabeth, I completely agree with you about Wet Wendy, and I'm so glad you've raised this. No one else has. This HR monster is out of the bottle now and won't be put back, certainly not by the socialists. It's far too useful for getting rid of political opponents. And Robert, Conservative Party has been lost. Ridiculous Williamson had to apologise. Well, I said they were fruity. At least they weren't in Anglo-Saxon. This week, it has been reported that the FCA is reviewing how banks treat politicians amidst the backdrop of the NatWest debanking scandal, with many other political figures experiencing similar treatment. It seems that the Financial Conduct Authority has finally woken from its slumbers and has now issued a warning to banks who wrongly deny accounts to politicians and their families. For the record, I am a politician and I do have a family. In July, Nigel Farage was debanked by Messrs Coutts and Company, where it was later shown his political views were considered as a factor in his account closure. Now, over a month later, Sarah Pritchard, Executive Director at the Financial Conduct Authority, has promised the regulator is willing to act if banks treat politicians unfairly, and concludes that the FCA is working on 2 reviews. Oh dear. The first review is looking into how politically exposed persons are handled, which predated the Farage case, and the second looks into the scale of the general debanking problem. This overall is, of course, good news and acts in accordance with the amendments to the Digital Markets Bill, which I proposed, to prevent banks from blacklisting customers who hold controversial views. The question remains, why has it taken the FCA so long to take action? I'm joined now by my expert panel, the journalist and broadcaster, Michael Crick, and the director of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young. Toby, does anybody ever give you a bank account?
Yes, but they quite quickly took it away again, Jacob. So PayPal. I had 3 accounts with PayPal, and all 3 were closed within 15 minutes of each other in September of last year. I kicked up a fuss. You very kindly spoke up about it in Parliament, and all 3 accounts were restored. And we then complained to the FCA that they hadn't followed the regulations in closing the accounts. They'd given us no notice, no explanation, just closed them immediately. And the FCA got back to us and said, we may or may not investigate this, we'll let you know in due course, which was a bit annoying. But if they really are going to fine banks for being too trigger-happy when it comes to denying people accounts because they're politically exposed people, then that is a good thing.
I've actually got more sympathy for banks on politically exposed people because we, the politicians, introduced the rules on politically exposed people. Where I'm more concerned is on the debanking of people for opinions, whether they're religious opinions or political opinions, where they're not politically active. The government could change the rules on PEPs and then the banks would follow them. But on the other bit, this is the woke brigade at work, isn't it?
Yes, I think it is. And I think that what's unfortunate about this announcement today is it looks like politicians are getting preferential treatment and that other people the people you described with other controversial views on political matters or religious matters are going to be left as they were. It's absolutely right that the banks should be fined for this, and if they do it persistently, they should be closed down. Because the number of opportunities you have to look after your money, you can't operate in the modern world without a bank account. It's very, very difficult. Cash is increasingly not taken in all sorts of places. and in any case, it's impractical as well a lot of the time. So it's absolutely vital. It's like denying people water or energy. And therefore, it's right that this action should be taken, and it should be done swiftly.
And that's a very important point, isn't it? Because, Toby, you and I, as broadly capitalists, would generally think that businesses should be free not to work with people they don't want to work with. But banking, as Michael says, is like water supply or electricity supply. It is a fundamental to daily life, and therefore to take away that service leaves people completely exposed.
Yeah, and I think to deny someone a bank account because you disapprove of their perfectly lawful political views feels like an act of discrimination which shouldn't be allowed. We don't allow banks to discriminate against their customers on the basis of the colour of their skin or their sexual orientation, so why should they be able to discriminate against them on the basis of their perfectly lawful political beliefs? Just one point, Michael, we've done some research at the Free Speech Union, we've published some FAQs about what you should do if you are debanked. We found out that all the main high street banks are signed up to something called the Basic Banking Agreement, which means that if they do try and close your account, you can actually say to them, look, I'm entitled to a basic bank account, for which you can't be charged by the bank. You don't have all the facilities you would with a normal bank account, but you can still have a bank account with one of these high street banks, and they're not allowed to shut you down because they're signatories to this agreement, because they don't tell you that when they cancel your account.
That's really useful to know as a constituency MP when people write to me saying, I've lost my bank account, to tell them.
Does it earn interest, this basic bank account? I bet it doesn't.
I don't think it does.
Right,
well, that's rather important at the moment.
Free, though.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is important at the moment. And if you have people who are complaining and being fined, and the banks are being fined, does this solve the problem, or is it a cultural change that the banks need so they don't get into this position in the first place?
I just don't understand how banks got here. I mean, there must be armies of people in these banks going through articles that Toby's written or I've written or you've written or things you've said on GBNews.
The Co-op Bank hadn't debanked Rose West, which in my view was perfectly proper because she hadn't committed a financial crime, and even murderers need to have a bank account,
Exactly.
don't they?
And also we believe in rehabilitation.
And we believe in rehabilitation.
And what's the point? Yeah.
And the only people you should be taking bank accounts away from are people who are fraudsters and are using their bank for illegal purposes. Like you can cut off the electricity from people who are stealing it for cannabis farms.
I think the root of the problem is not that the banks have been captured by the woke and they're enforcing woke ideology by debanking people who don't sign up to Pride and the rest of it. I think it's actually more an excess of caution on the part of the banks. They all sign up to these international checking agencies like WorldCheck, and they flag up people all the time as being high risk based on a couple of articles that have appeared about them in the Daily Mail or something they've said on social media.
OK, but this is the fault of governments and agreements that we have made. I found this when I worked in financial services, that we had to ask people of international repute for their passports to prove that they really were who they said they were. And we have set up these hoops to assume everybody, particularly anybody overseas, is a crook. And therefore, if you're dealing with them, you've got to know absolutely every last bit of evidence that they are who they say they are. And that's then fed down into much, much smaller scale banking transactions.
Another thing we urge people who have been debanked to do in these FAQs we've published on the Free Speech Union website, which are free to view, is you can submit the equivalent of a subject access request to WorldCheck, this international checking agency. And if they have got any information on you, they're obliged to disclose that. And often it turns out to be inaccurate, and you can get them to remove it, and then you can have your bank account restored.
One great thing about this whole episode is that actually it's drawn to people's attention the fact you can apply for subject access requests.
Yes.
And I don't think most people knew that.
No.
And a lot of people will be encouraged to do so. And banks like NatWest and Coots, and all of them must be tearing their hair out now that the whole Farage episode has caused this.
But there is a glorious irony in this. That it is an EU law that gave us the right to subject data access requests, and who uses it to the greatest advantage? Nigel. So it's very brilliant.
And are there plans to repeal it?
Thank you to my panel. Coming up, it's the cross-section of concrete and civil service impartiality. Plus, could there be a local council with more woes than woking?
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello again.
As we go through the next 24 hours, some of us will have a bit of low cloud and fog overnight, but then it's the return of the hot sunshine tomorrow, albeit with the chance of a few showers. Looking at the big picture, and you can see high pressure dominating the weather across the UK, but we are going to have something of an easterly wind pushing its way in, and on that easterly, we're going to drag in some low cloud, some sea fog in from the North Sea, affecting eastern parts of England and also eastern Scotland, where we're likely to see a little bit of drizzly rain overnight. Elsewhere, further south and west, clear skies, a few pockets of mist and fog though, and temperatures not dropping a huge amount. Some places staying above 20 Celsius tonight, a tropical night for some, but a difficult night for sleeping. A cloudy start then down the eastern side of the UK on Wednesday, but that low cloud, that murk, is going to quite quickly burn back towards the coast for most of us. I say for most because across eastern parts of Scotland we're likely to hold on to some of that low cloud. Otherwise, lots of sunshine around, but perhaps a bit cloudier for some, particularly across parts of Northern Ireland. Look at those temperatures though, a little bit higher than today, likely to see highs around 32 or 33 Celsius. Into Thursday, and there's the chance of some heavy thundery showers making their way northwards up the western side of the UK. More central and eastern parts of the country are likely to stay drier and sunnier, and temperatures are going to be similar to tomorrow really. Again, likely to see highs of 32 or 33 before something perhaps cooler by the weekend.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views, and often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Tim says, this is a really good point. Thank you, Tim. There's no point in imposing fines on the banks. In NatWest case, that would simply mean we, the people, are effectively fine since we own 38% of the bank. The bank is not a person, but an institution. Graham says it isn't only banks cancelling people for holding non-woke views. I was thrown off Sky TV owing to my opinions on their diversity drive. I obviously don't know Sky's side of the story. Be very interested to find out what that case was about and hear from Sky as to whether they do throw people off for views. I expect they would deny it. Nigel says, since the removal of bank managers in the 1990s and the digital system was started, banks are, as you say, like any utility, electric, gas, water. They wanted it, and the chickens are now coming home to roost. I wonder if they're free-range chickens coming home to roost. Well, it's been the defining story of the week. Hundreds of schools face the threat of a new kind of lockdown owing to the concrete crisis. It's actually the 1960s crisis when all buildings were hideous and badly built. The crisis, which the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, cemented into the front pages after a rather spicy candid camera moment yesterday, has carried on. The story you may not have picked up on was the fact that a former senior civil servant, the once permanent secretary of the Department of Education, Jonathan Slater, who had to leave the department after the COVID exam marking chaos, spoke to the BBC's Today programme and tried to throw the blame on the Prime Minister, to throw him under a bus, so to speak, accusing him of responsibility for the crisis faced by so many of Britain's schools. He is a former civil servant and therefore has the freedom to speak whenever he pleases. But has he broken the protocol by feeding a hungry opposition for talking points? Is this part of a change in the civil service moving into a more political arena? We see the new Labour Chief of Staff and the civil service showing their true colours. Well, my panel may have some answers. The journalist and broadcaster, Michael Crick, and the director of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young. Michael, is this the civil service thinking that perhaps the opinion polls aren't great for the Conservatives? They can now bash a Conservative government as much as they like. So Sue Gray...
Well, Slater is no longer a civil servant, so you can't really say that. I think he was right to speak out. I mean, this is potentially very, very serious. I mean, you could envisage another sort of Aberfan situation where a school collapses and scores of children are killed. And it's absolutely right, I think, in those circumstances for former officials, certainly, and maybe even existing officials, to speak out.
But doesn't he, to some extent, expose himself that he was the permanent secretary? Why didn't he devote all the building budget to this rack?
Well, that is up to...
Isn't he just basically protecting his position before people point the finger at him?
Well, there may be an element of that, but on the other hand, I still think it's absolutely right. I think there's been too many scandals in government where officials or former officials should have spoken out in the past, and maybe if they had, some of those scandals would have been avoided. Having said that, I think the protocol for ex-civil servants has weakened. People like Gus O'Donnell, Andrew Turnbull, former cabinet secretaries, Lord Kerslake, who died a few weeks ago, former head of the civil service. I've been much more willing in recent years to take sides in debates than they used to be.
It's not how Robert Armstrong would have behaved, is it, Toby?
No, I disagree with Michael. I don't think civil servants, even after they've retired, should tell tales out of school in the way he's done. I mean, it will make it harder for ministers in future to trust their civil servants if they have to worry that the conversations they have with them, seemingly in confidence, could be betrayed in a few years' time to politically embarrass them. I worked a little bit with Jonathan Slater, certainly with his department, when I was head of the New Schools Network.
We
when
tried
he was
to blame
the
it all on
secretary.
free schools. He said the government's obsessed with free schools, therefore hasn't spent money on making buildings.
It was clear he was never a supporter of the free schools programme, and it was pretty obvious where his political sympathies lie, because under him the DFE became part of the Stonewall Diversity Champions programme. I absolutely take issue with the argument he made on the Today programme, which is that the government prioritised the building of free schools over the maintenance of the crumbling school estate. The fact is we needed more schools. We still do need more schools because of the population boom. And it turns out that free schools are a much cheaper way to provide those much needed places than doing it the old way under Labour's Building Schools for the Future programme. So free schools were actually saving the department money and not costing it money that it could have otherwise spent on the crumbling estate.
Supposing Slater is brought before a select committee, the Education Select Committee, or whatever committee consider the right one, and he is asked about this. Are you saying that he should say, I'm sorry, I can't talk about it, I'm a former civil servant, protocols and all of that? No, of course not. It's right that in very serious situations like this, that public servants or former public servants, and I'd say existing public servants, where it's really, really serious, should be able to blow the whistle, essentially.
I think that's a good point, because one of the things that's really puzzled me about public life is the desire of governments to cover up mistakes made by preceding generations of government. On Thursday in the House of Commons, we're going to debate Primados, which is a drug that did damage to children in the 1960s, and where the Department for Health is still trying to pretend that it didn't do this damage. And it just seems weird that here we are, 55 years later, and still people are saying, oh, well, no, don't look here.
And time and again...
I'm quite sympathetic to my
Well, I think if civil servants were, senior civil servants like him, were political appointees and clearly declared their political allegiance, then fine, they could enter the fray in this way when they've left their jobs. But the fact is, he's trading on the fact that he is supposedly impartial, a trusted, unbiased public servant in order to make his remarks more credible and make them land, when in fact he's clearly partisan.
Position. So, in other political news, we had the energy bill. I think there were 19 people who voted against the bill, of which I was one. I'm quite pleased by that, because normally the smaller the minority you're in Parliament, the more you turn out to be right. I was one of 13, which Toby will approve of, who voted against Leveson, against 530 in favour. I think there's not a single Conservative left who thinks Leveson was a good idea. But this is about making life more...
Perhaps you should rebel on everything in that case.
A lot of times I support the government, a very good government in so many ways. But the energy bill is simply going to make people's lives more expensive. What is the point of going after this green dream on the backs of the least well-off in British society?
The world is facing a huge crisis. I did the calculations on the way here. In 1,000 years' time, there will be 3 billion people descended from you. You have a duty. In your case, it's probably slightly fewer. But you have a duty to future generations, your children, grandchildren, many, many great-grandchildren, to save this planet from the disasters. And there is a cost to us all. We are the richest generation this country, this planet has ever seen. And we should be willing to make the sacrifices. I'm not saying that we should all make them equally. Clearly, richer people, and a lot of people have become very rich in the last few years.
But the sacrifices don't fall on us. They fall on my least well-off constituents who are struggling to heat their homes. And
well, there are ways of adjusting for that. But in terms of the new costs that are imposed in the...
Realistically, because you make it harder for them to drive their cars, more expensive for them to heat their homes, where are you getting the money for all this? So you have to say that least well-off in Western society have to accept a lower standard of living, whilst those of us who are better off will be absolutely fine.
I think you've got to...
I think you make a really good point, Jacob. But another point, I mean, I dispute that the link between carbon emissions and climate change has been proved beyond doubt, such that we need to beggar ourselves in order to tackle the problem. But let's suppose you're right, and there is this link. Why should we be paying such a heavy price? We contribute 1% of the global carbon emissions. Michael, China every year produces more carbon emissions than the UK has done since the time of the Industrial Revolution. China produces a new industrial-fired, a coal-fired power station every week. We've already reduced our carbon emissions generated by electricity have fallen by 75% since 1990. We've done our part, if you're right. So why should we be doing
And we should carry on doing our part and setting an example to the world. And if you spend your life saying, well, somebody else should do it, or if we do it, it makes no difference, then nobody ends up doing it, and the crisis is even greater.
Cheap energy from 1990 has been one of the key factors in lowering absolute poverty in the world. So in 1990, over 50% of the world were in absolute poverty. It's now down about 10%. This is terrifically important, but it's been dependent upon cheap energy. Would you sacrifice that for a noble but unattainable goal?
Well, you would have to... people who are cleverer than me, and in a way I'm rebuffing your question, but clever people can think of ways of keeping energy pretty cheap and making the costs elsewhere. But we have to deal with this problem, that we need the best and brightest brains to deal with this problem. Because otherwise, other issues on which you're concerned, for instance, migration into this country, are going to become huge. I mean, the consequences of this... And Toby says he's not yet convinced. Well, there comes a point that, whenever you will be convinced, will probably be too late. I don't want to take a gamble on it, right? I want to take the measures now And if you do it in the right way, that can boost the economy and economic activity instead of
I think
leading us all into poverty.
You often hear the argument that technology will solve the problem and will come up with cheap and effective energy, which is just as effective as oil and gas. So we don't need to worry about the economic impact.
That's not my argument.
Surely we should wait until we've developed those technologies before we begin to immiserate ourselves.
Well, that may not happen.
Lord Asquith, the Prime Minister in the early 20th century, and wait and see. Thank you to my panel. Coming up, it's the latest council to go bankrupt. We'll be hearing from one of the councillors.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. And Tony says, no way should civil servants express personal views and must be ordered to support government in office. Well, that's the Northcote Trevelyan way. Last night, we hosted the competition for incompetent councils, and almost as if they'd tuned in and wished to join in the fun, Birmingham Council this morning declared itself effectively bankrupt. Well, their efforts were not in vain, and we shall without hesitation invite them onto the leadership board of Britain's most useless councils. This morning, the council, the largest local authority in Europe, issued a Section 114 notice putting a moratorium on all spending except upon the most essential services. After a long history of serial mismanagement, the council has been brought to its knees financially. The most salient event in the whole sorry affair is the £1.1 billion that the council has been forced to pay out since 2012 in equal pay claims after a landmark ruling. The council's failure to pay its employees equally resulted in this huge bill of taxpayers' money. There's still a further £760 million to pay, piling on the misery for Birmingham residents. Poor governance also resulted in the implementation of a new IT system, this is the bane of all governments, being delayed by 3 years, with costs ballooning nearly over fivefold from 19 to £100 million. The slow drip of bureaucratic treacle has stymied effective local government and seen Birmingham Council's coffers empty. The council's own incompetence is the sole reason for this largest of pickles that they've now found themselves in. Yet the real loser are the working people of Birmingham. I'm now joined by Robert Alden, the leader of the Conservatives at Birmingham City Council. Robert, thank you very much for joining me. How much of this is bad luck and it dates back to payment practices of the past, and how much is this day-to-day mismanagement?
Evening. Sadly, this is entirely the fault of the last 6 years of Labour rule in Birmingham. When you look at the Section 114 notice that's been issued today, it's very clear that the failure to budget for the equal pay, the £760 million you've already mentioned, and the £100 million on the Oracle system, has led the council to have to declare itself bankrupt. This is a problem entirely in the making of the Labour leader's office in Birmingham City Council. And as you've mentioned, sadly, it's the working people of Birmingham who are now going to suffer for Labour's failure.
So what do you think could have been done differently? And I suppose the other question is, if the council is now only going to spend on essential services that are required by law, what's it spending the rest of the money on? What is actually being cut?
Well, to pick up that first point, when you look at what Birmingham Labour have done over the last decade, it's failed to act quickly. So they were warned by the auditors, they were warned by ourselves as the opposition, they were warned by the trade unions, and they were warned by staff at the council that action was needed quickly to resolve the equal pay issues years ago. And sadly, they've ignored those warnings. And even this summer, when they were given a final chance by the auditors, they cancelled and postponed meeting after meeting, delaying decisions on equal pay, costing the council up to £14 million a month.
So it's the failure to make a decision that has really been the worst. They've just pushed things into the long grass and not got on with things.
Exactly.
And so the skeletal council, what is being cut? What is happening that you and I as Conservatives don't think that people will miss? I mean, are there many opportunities to make real beneficial savings in these circumstances?
Well, the council could certainly be looking at the amount it spends on consultants. It spends around £30 million a year on consultants here in Birmingham. The council's poor decision-making in procurement, procuring contracts late. So only today the council's been trying to re-procure a contract at only a week's notice. Those kind of decisions, which if we were running the council, we'd be looking to do in a more timely manner, would ensure the council could make savings. But what residents are going to really feel is that vital support, things like cost of living support, which the Cabinet in Birmingham, the Labour Cabinet, removed this morning because they could no longer approve it because of this Section 114 notice.
OK, well, thank you very much, Robert. Still with me is my indefatigable panel. Michael.
Well, it's an interesting discussion, this. And Birmingham is not the only council that's gone bankrupt. It's happened all over the country, and it's no wonder because of the way in which councils have been treated by particularly the government of which you've been a supporter for the last 13 years. The squeeze on local government has been much greater than the squeeze on central government. And let's face it, there have been some pretty bad procurement cock-ups in central government as well, PPE, for example. But there have been Conservative councils that have gone bankrupt. Northamptonshire, I remember doing a story about them some years ago. Woking ran into trouble under the Conservatives. I think they've lost control there now. It's difficult to remember who's running each of these councils. Kent have argued for years, which was Conservative. I can't remember if Kent's still run by the Conservatives, but it was certainly, if it has been arguing, it's Kent Conservative leaders there have been arguing that the squeeze on them has been huge. They've gone into deficits. They've had to cut back. This has been something across local government, which actually I think most local government is rather better run than central government. Even in your own Somerset. I was checking just before we came. They've had the councils in Somerset have had to make cuts. It's been going on everywhere.
Somerset Council is appallingly run. It spent £9 million or something on a ring of steel in Bath and doesn't get on with the basic services.
Yes, it was a bit stupid to bring up Somerset when you know much more about it than you do, than I do. Yeah.
But Toby, I mean, I just wonder whether our local government doesn't really work because it tries to do too much, it empire builds, it spends too much money, the bureaucracies have got bigger and bigger, as we've consolidated councils, we've taken them away from local communities and made them large organisations that just are bureaucracies that don't get on with a proper job.
Yes, and when they're councils where there isn't often a change of control, the people in charge are the town hall Sir Humphreys, and they're notoriously bad at running their local authorities. They stymie innovation, they stop schools being set up in their local area. They're in part responsible for these crumbling schools. It's not entirely something that can be laid at the door of the DfE. But this is a particularly egregious example. But as you say, I think they have too much money and too much power.
Well, Birmingham, I can't remember when Birmingham, but Birmingham certainly in recent times has been run by the Conservatives. Presumably they had a role in the failure to pay people equally.
Right. It was, of course, run by the Liberals.
Indeed, but that was even before you were... But I mean, and it's not always the case where one-party rule produces a bad... I mean, Manchester, for instance, which has been a one-party state now, used to be Conservative, one-party state effectively for 20 years now, and also had a very good chief executive, was rather well run.
So,
but the other thing I would say...
read a statement. Birmingham City Council. Birmingham City Council has issued a Section 114 notice as part of the plans to meet the council's financial liabilities relating to equal pay claims and an in-year financial gap within its budget, which currently stands in the region of £87 million. In June, the council announced that it had potential liability relating to equal pay claims in the region of £650 million to £760 million, with an ongoing liability accruing at a rate of £5 million to £14 million per month. The council's senior officers and members are committed to dealing with the financial situation, and when more information is available, it will be shared. Well, I'm sure that's reassuring to you all. 87 million in-year budget. That's the one you should really watch. That's all from me. Up next, it's our resident professor, Professor Daniel Wootton. Dan, what's coming up on your programme?
Well, we're very excited, Jacob. We have a brand new Tuesday Superstar panel, so I'm going to give you some clues, see if you can guess who she is. She attended Cabinet under May, Johnson and Cameron, former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, married to a Conservative MP. Do you have any ideas?
Oh, yes, of course I know exactly who she is. It's Esther McVeigh.
Yes!
Esther and I were in the Right Division lobby early on. Actually, most of the GB News producers were voting against the dreadful energy bill.
Yeah, she made it in time.
She's absolutely brilliant. That's coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. And it's going to be sunshine in Somerset tomorrow and probably over 80 degrees in proper temperature levels.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello again. As we go through the next 24 hours, some of us will have a bit of low cloud and fog overnight, but then it's the return of the hot sunshine tomorrow, albeit with the chance of a few showers. Looking at the big picture, and you can see high pressure dominating the weather across the UK, but we are going to have something of an easterly wind pushing its way in, and on that easterly, we're going to drag in some low cloud, some sea fog in from the North Sea, affecting eastern parts of England and also eastern Scotland, where we're likely to see a little bit of drizzly rain overnight. Elsewhere, further south and west, clear skies, a few pockets of mist and fog though, and temperatures not dropping a huge amount. Some places staying above 20 Celsius tonight, a tropical night for some, but a difficult night for sleeping. A cloudy start then down the eastern side of the UK on Wednesday, but that low cloud, that murk, is going to quite quickly burn back towards the coast for most of us. I say for most because across eastern parts of Scotland we're likely to hold on to some of that low cloud. Otherwise, lots of sunshine around, but perhaps a bit cloudier for some, particularly across parts of Northern Ireland. Look at those temperatures though, a little bit higher than today, likely to see highs around 32 or 33 Celsius. Into Thursday, and there's the chance of some heavy thundery showers making their way northwards up the western side of the UK. More central and eastern parts of the country are likely to stay drier and sunnier, and temperatures are going to be similar to tomorrow, really. Again, likely to see highs of 32 or 33 before something perhaps cooler by the weekend.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate.